Hi, welcome to the Chariot Tech Chat Tuesday. I'm Ken Rimple, and I'm joined today by Michael Hulet, who is an engineer at Chariot, who does a lot of iOS and Apple-based application development and architecture. So thank you, Michael, for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I know we had you on earlier about some accessibility stuff, and I know we
Mhm.
wanted to do a couple things in addition to that, and just kind of keep the conversation about Apple-based development going. The one thing I wanted to do when I reached out to you is talk about all these new announcements and these new features that have come out, and even new products that have come out since WWDC 2023.
Mhm.
So I'm really glad you're here to talk to me. And you kind of came up with a good list, like an inventory of all the things we can, chat about that you were paying attention to, based on the keynote and based on things you've been paying attention to. Um, so I'd like to kind of dive in and start talking about things with you from a developer perspective.
Sure.
So like obviously there's a lot of like updates to APIs, updates to language features. I guess the biggest one is like people are now developing in Swift for the last couple of years, switched over from a number of years ago from Objective C, and there are platforms and APIs based on Swift that have been coming out. So why don't we talk a bit about kind of like what's, for people who aren't necessarily up to date on it, what is Swift UI, and like where has it headed over the last couple of years?
Yeah, sure. So if you're not familiar with the Apple development world, SwiftUI came out in 2013. I should probably so before that, to make apps for iPhones, you had a framework called UIKit. To make apps for Mac, you had a framework called AppKit. To make apps for Apple Watch, you had a framework called WatchKit. It was all this fragmented. You had to be specialized in each little individual area in order to make a good app for each individual platform. SwiftUI came out, and its sort of goal was to be a good cross-platform UI framework within the Apple ecosystem. So it's not cross-platform in the sense of like you can make an Android app with it, although it might get there eventually.
Mm-hmm.
But you can write the same UI code once, and it will run and look good on iPhone, Mac, tvOS, watchOS. Apple's brand new Vision OS supports it. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and in addition to that, it is type safe and declarative. So UI programmers like think of HTML or CSS, things like that. UI tends to fit the declarative model fairly well. And so SwiftUI is a DSL that sort of allows you to write UI code for Apple platforms and Apple styles in a sort of declarative kind of way. Um, so it's not necessarily as powerful as the old UI frameworks quite yet, but it's definitely come a long way over the last 4 years. Launched with iOS 13. I'm bad at math. I guess that must have been 2019. iOS
So am I.
17's latest zero is just announced. So yeah, come a long way. It's definitely gotten a lot more fun to use in the last couple of years. I think a lot of engineers are still on the fence about whether it's ready to use in production necessarily for their app. But anecdotally, the project that I'm on right now is Pure Swift UI. The project I was on before this is Pure Swift UI. The company I worked at before Chariot was Pure Swift UI. It's been a good 2 or 3 years now since I worked on an app that was mainly UI kit based. So yeah, been having a good time with it.
Okay. So the major changes that they're announcing. So is this observables concept here, for example, one of the things, is that a new concept for them, making things reactive and observable in the UI kit, or is it just, or I'm sorry, in Swift UI, I'm going to do this,
Mm-hmm.
in Swift UI, or has it been doable in other ways and just as like a nicety for the developer to make it easier for them to work with it?
Yeah, so SwiftUI was designed around the concept of reactivity originally. In fact, when Apple launched SwiftUI, they launched it alongside another framework they made called Combine. What Combine does, you can think of it as like if you ever used one of those like RX frameworks, like RX Swift
Yep.
or RX Java, it was kind of
Yep.
supposed to be a first-party competitor to that, where you operate on data as a stream of transformations, and you can build a pipeline and wire things together like that. So internally, SwiftUI uses Combine to react to state changes, pass around bindings, manage the environment, things like that. Um, However, Apple seemed to just sort of like abandon combine relatively quickly for some reason. The way you would handle this kind of thing in SwiftUI before is each individual view would manage its own state internally. You would mark properties that could affect the view's rendering with @state. If you wanted to pass data from one view to another and have it still affect rendering, that'd be a binding. Now, of course, that would be different between value types and reference types. So you would have state and for value types and state object for reference types, and same with environment and environment object, or even observed object and things like that. It all got really complicated really fast. So what the new observables in Swift 5.9 are, it makes that like a language level feature. So rather than SwiftUI leveraging combine under the hood and this web of complex technologies that all work together, it's just the language manages it for you. So rather than having to think about what state, what should be a binding, is this a reference type, is this a value type, am I really getting things observed properly? All you need to do is take your model objects you would put together with like observable object and @published everything and carefully laid out what needs to affect the render flow and whatnot. All you got to do is mark the model type as @observable now, and Swift will just figure out what actually affects your rendering and what doesn't. And so it'll all just sort of work.
That's very cool. Okay, yeah, it's a nice upgrade.
Yeah, and likewise, when you go back to the view layer, you don't have to think about like, is this a state value type, reference type? Should it be a state object or an observable object? You just have @state, @bindable, and @environment now, which all serve basically the same purpose that @state and @binding and environment and did before, but you don't have to think about value types versus reference types and what's going to affect what. It's just the language can resolve all that for you through the new macro system.
Okay. Looks like there are a fair number of features in there around scrolling and like making scrolling easier to work with and more performant, right?
Yeah. So in new SwiftUI, so scroll views have always been somewhat of a pain in SwiftUI. In the original version of SwiftUI, and for the longest time, all you got was just, here's a scroll view. Like, you can put stuff in it. That's about it. It'll scroll. When I was on here last, talked about accessibility. One of the things I brought up was that realistically, a scroll view should be towards the root of nearly every view hierarchy, because the user could have a different dynamic type setting, turn that all the way up, have a different language which uses longer words. Nearly every screen will eventually overflow with some kind of setting combination and device combination. So you should have a scroll view towards the root of your hierarchy. But before in SwiftUI, it was difficult to create a good user experience that way, because if you put something in a scroll view, it's going to scroll. Even if it doesn't overflow on any normal, like the average screen size, you would still get that bouncing effect whenever you scrolled, which isn't, that doesn't look good. That doesn't feel good. You don't expect your content to move around on you when it all fits. Yeah. So there were lots of weird hacks you could do before to emulate something like that. I think I have like an overflow view that I use in nearly every project, which leverages like 3 different methods of emulating something like that based on the platform version. But in new SwiftUI, that's just a one-line modifier. It's like the scroll bounce behavior dot overflow only or something like that. It's super easy. You get more access to controlling the indicator, and you can like give it padding. One of the things that was really interesting was custom transitions on scrolling. So as I said before, when it was just standard scroll view, things would get cut off eventually. With this, you can actually animate things on and off screen. Like if you've ever been on Apple.com while they're like launching a interesting new product or something, like go to one of their iPhone pages or something and scroll down it, you get all these wild like animations, things going on and off the screen as you scroll, things fading in and out. That was just straight up impossible to do in SwiftUI before, or at least incredibly difficult. Now it's incredibly easy. Whole new class of interactions are possible through some new animation APIs around that. It'll be a lot of fun.
Cool. And also, I see a bunch of stuff for animations too, right? So, looks like the spring animation is a new way of doing animations. Is that right? Or a mechanism of animation? I don't know enough about animations on iOS.
Yeah. So before the default animate, so one of the things that always made SwiftUI cool was how it can manage animations in a way that you don't even really have to think about it. You just sort of have to put like dot animation on your view, and whatever other changes are it's going through, like frame layout, that kind of thing, will just sort of like animate naturally and it'll look really pretty. Whereas that could be a real pain in UIKit and core animation and all that before it. The default animation that you would get when you just do dot animation, I'm not sure if that was ever explicitly defined what it was before, but in iOS 17 or whatever, like the latest platforms, I shouldn't use iOS because SwiftUI runs on anything now, including Vision OS and all that. With the latest versions of the operating systems that'll come out this fall, the default animation is defined to be a spring animation in which rather than like imagine like a linear animation where it's just like straight line or ease and out kind of thing. A spring animation will start a little fast, slow down, and then bounce at the end. It looks a lot like Apple's standard animations that they've been using in the operating system forever. The concept of a spring animation has been around since it's got to be a good close to 10 years now in UIKit. But the API for it was really weird and unintuitive. Like you would have to manage timing through like properties like damping, which I'm not a physicist, I'm a programmer. I don't think about
Don't make me think about that.
Like
Yeah,
exactly. I saw several years ago a thread on Twitter where the original designer of the Spring Animation API that's been in UIKit forever basically wrote like one of those like notes app apology kind of things. Where it's like, yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So the Spring API, the Spring Animation API now like makes sense. You animate over a specified period of time with with a specific amount of bounciness and things like that. Things that make sense to people who don't have the domain knowledge of how like physics works and things like that.
Right. No lepton setting.
Right, exactly.
Or whatever the heck, you know.
And also really cool now is animations can have completion handlers. So you can run code once an animation has finished,
that's cool.
Which was sort of difficult before because the UIKit API had like UI view animate with transition. It had a completion handler with it. And so it got kind of normal to just like do this bit after this animation's done, maybe even trigger a different animation, something like that. But the only way to do that in SwiftUI prior to this was like pass around timings throughout your view hierarchy, and it would get really weird and hard to manage and hard to follow. So that shouldn't be as difficult anymore, which is really nice.
Good. I also see in here, so for example, there's a lot of UI specific things in addition to that, like shaders and stuff. We'll hold off on that. But there's now haptics, for example. And I kind of want to jump ahead because the big announcement was the one more thing announcement, which was the new Apple Vision platform, right?
Right.
The new headset. So I guess some of the things around haptics and things like that, I would think some of that is geared towards supporting a user interface where you've got something on your head and you're kind of moving things around, right?
So, I'm actually not cool enough to have gotten access to Apple Vision Pro hardware yet.
Very few of us would be. In fact, none of us would be.
They had a like a demo lab at like the physical version of WWDC a couple weeks ago. By the way, we should put a little timestamp on this video right now. As we're recording this, it is June 27th. We're on beta 2 right now. If you find bugs and we're like wanting them to support your use case or whatever, file feedback right now through the feedback assistant app. Because by the time this video is published, I understand we're not going to publish for a couple of weeks. It'll probably be 2 or 3 more betas along. So
true.
Yeah, they had a lab for this at the in-person WWDC. So some like influencers and media people and a handful of specific developers got to try it out. They say that they're going to make a developer kit available in a few months before a launch early next year. But anyway, that's all to say. I don't really know all that much about haptics yet because all that I have available to me is the simulator that shipped with Xcode Beta 2.
Oh, there's a simulator for it, really?
Yeah, there's a simulator for it that shipped with Beta 2 of
Mm-hmm.
Xcode, I think last week.
Okay.
I haven't
That's
gotten a
interesting.
ton of opportunity to play around with it yet. I understand it's really, really limited as is, and even trying to run it makes the fan turn on your nice M2 MacBook, which
It's one of the only things that would, yeah.
I have I think it's an M2 Pro MacBook Pro, something like that. I have literally never once heard the fan turn on this machine in the year I've been using it. So I'm sort of excited to find out if this can do it. I imagine haptics will play some kind of a role on that, but they have been around in iOS in particular for several years. This is just one of the as UIKit and the things like that are very old, mature frameworks. UIKit came out with the iPhone OS SDK in 2008. It's been the way to develop for iPhone apps. So if the iPhone could do something, the way you would get to it is through UIKit. SwiftUI is pretty new. They've been building it up over recent years, and this is just an area it hasn't touched yet that now it has access to natively. So the way you would have to do it before is go through all the UI haptic APIs. But now there's a native way to do it through SwiftUI, which will be really nice. Now, of course, haptics are semantic in iOS. You shouldn't just play them whenever. They have meanings, and you should only trigger them at times when those meanings are happening. That doesn't change. But now it's just a one-liner in SwiftUI instead of having to set up a whole object and configure it and prepare and time all that yourself.
Yeah, I get you there. Now, there's a new API here in Swift that's called SwiftData, right? So core data has been around since Dirt was invented. So, so now this is supposed to be a replacement for core data in some circumstances, correct?
Yeah, it's supposed to be
in terms of programming through core data. Yeah.
Right. It's supposed to be the long term. You should use this in Swift instead of core data replacement. So core data came about. Do you remember Next Step from the 1980s? Core data was developed by Next Step alongside Objective C. It's been around before
Dirt.
Apple. Yeah, before Apple bought Next Step. And one of the things that it builds. So I said it came out alongside Objective C. It builds on lots of the concepts that Objective C made cool. So Objective C was one of the first object-oriented programming languages where you pass messages to objects through selectors and things like that, heavily inspired by Smalltalk and languages like that. Now, Objective-C is famously very, very dynamic. You can send a message to nil and not crash, and that's perfectly valid. Now, the whole reason Swift came about is because we realize as an industry that's generally a terrible idea. Crashes are occasionally appropriate when things are exceptionally wrong, and not having good Swift checks for sanity ahead of time so that it's far less likely to crash in the wild. And so
it doesn't swallow it as a developer. You don't know why this thing isn't responding.
Right.
You at least could get a message saying, I don't know what to do with this thing. Boom. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Better yet, you were forced to handle at compile time. Well, what if this thing is nil? What should I do then? You can't just accidentally have something be nil and have something not work down the line. You have to know you know ahead of time. Is this optional? Is this not optional? And have to handle the nil case explicitly. And so that didn't map onto core data very well because core data is made to be very dynamic, built on top of the things that made Objective-C cool at the time, which is runtime dynamism and all that. Which meant that when you are inserting data in your data model from Swift, anything could be nil, and you ended up writing a whole bunch of extra boilerplate code, which is very frustrating. Its multi-threading model is very annoying. I've never seen anybody just do it right first time. It's this large, difficult to manage, somewhat nebulous framework to manage data. And so when you have that as at the core of your app, it can lead to crashes and issues relatively easily. So SwiftData wraps that in a way that is natural in Swift with its ethos. So rather than having to like define a data model ahead of time, for example, prior with core data, it was very common to like define all your entities and all their attributes and relationships and all that in like a configuration file and XC data model D is the file extension or whatever, which by the way is not the same after it's compiled. You got to parse it as a mom-d at runtime. That's just all like not stuff that you have to think about anymore. SwiftData will infer that all for you. All you got to do is mark your model classes with @model, and then all the properties are stored properties now, and you can manage those directly with like attribute and that relationship to set up things like cascading delete rules or uniqueness constraints. But all in all, it's just the Swift that you're used to writing persists easily now. And there's still a bit of like I said before, it wraps core data under the hood. So you still have the concept of things like context and persistent stores. But those are all just sort of like set up for you by default. I think one of the coolest things about it too is it has a very explicit, easy migration path from old style core data to new Swift data. So you can clean up your model layers significantly, get rid of all the weird hacks to transition between different data types that for like coding and storage and things like that. It's just Swift does it now for you.
And it seems like you could like add you could add SwiftData and slowly migrate it piecemeal if you needed to get to the point where you're purely using almost completely SwiftData. But you can start with it and opt in and bring things in. It seems like from what you're saying in your one note here, like use both in the same app. So that's useful. They didn't make it like a switch. Well, nope, you have to completely convert and you can't use the old API, which is good.
Right, they're designed to coexist, which makes a lot of sense because you're like, so SwiftData, like lots of new things, only supports iOS 17, macOS Sonoma, etc. So you can't backport this to older versions. So if you are like most development shops and support latest -1 or latest -2, even -3, it will be several years before you can use SwiftData as your number one. So if you're going to use it today, you sort of have to have them coexist.
So that raises kind of an interesting point that if you really want to like program to all the new APIs, some of them at least, you will need to be running an app on the most recent OS or the new one that's coming out. But you would have to write a compatibility layer or like support both levels of APIs until that switches over. So it's not like a simple switch to convert over to the new one until everyone's pretty much off the old ones. But I know that the iOS developer or iOS users tend to upgrade more frequently than, let's say, Android, which you know people stay on their Android OS forever. Usually, if they're because the devices don't always support upgrades as easily. So I would think this is like a couple of versions out, right, before you're really going to only use SwiftData in the future.
Right. Like I said, it will most development shops support like current -1, current -2. Some of the really big ones go for like current -3. And so for those, it will be that number of years approximately until you can use it as your number one. Of course, if you're building something brand new and want to set your build target at iOS 17, that's great. I'm very jealous of you.
Not so many people can do that. Yeah, right.
Right.
All the snazzy apps will do that, but if you're going into business where you have to support the population, it's hard,
Right. Now, of course, there are, like, in the past, Swift 5.8 had several features where you could natively mark things to be backported to prior versions of your target operating system, which, I mean, that's cool. It's like version checks are at the language level, so the compiler can verify all that for you. But not 100% of everything can be net backported, but significant amount of things are. Like the whole observable system, I'm not sure which portions of it depend on platform-specific protocols, but in theory, since it's all implemented through the new macro system, that all happens at compile time. So in theory, you can use a lot of that on any version you're targeting.
Definitely sounds something to research at some point when you're really getting to the point where you're going to use it. Like, there's going to be strategies that people come up with, I'm sure. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Okay,
Yeah, that's
cool.
one of the reasons Swift macros are probably one of the things I'm most excited about this year. But
Hmm.
we already talked about that some. Yeah.
Yeah. So Apple Vision Pro. So now we'll talk a little bit more about this. So it's an AR, augmented and virtual reality platform. You can kind of fade in or out the real world. Bring the screen fully in, or like fade it so it's kind of like floating over top of things, or even almost transparent. Um, it's a
Hmm.
completely new platform. So, what is your thought about like where this thing is right now? I mean, it's
Yeah,
nowhere yet because it's not released yet. But go ahead.
yeah. So it's not going to go for public release until they say early 2024. The last time Apple
Mid,
launched a new project or a new
late.
product and said early next year, it was Apple Watch, and Apple Watch didn't launch until like end of April of the
Yeah,
following year or whatever.
yeah,
So I'm not expecting this for the better part of a year from now.
yeah.
But developer kits should come out. I mean, this fall. I think is what they're targeting.
Hmm.
Um, but so the concept of spatial computing, which is what they're trying to introduce with this, sounds really cool on its own. So they ultimately envision this to be something where like you don't need a Mac, you don't need an iPhone, you don't need a watch, you don't need all the other fancy stuff. All you need is Vision Pro. This is the future of computing. This is another 1984 Mac moment or 2007 iPhone moment for us, kind of thing. Where it
Yeah.
is right now, I'm not sure that this is not going to be the version that takes them to that level. It
Oh,
is
clearly
a
not. No.
it is a $3,500 pair of ski goggles.
or Android glasses, like I am taking over the world. It definitely looks like you're a bionic creature when you put them on.
Yeah, so Google Glass looked cooler in
Yes,
2013, and we
that's
saw
saying
where that
something.
went. Yeah, but so this is very transparently version one. We're launching this right now because we want a thriving ecosystem of third-party developers to make cool apps for this. So later on, when we get the hardware to the point where a normal person might want this, then
Hmm.
there's going to be good support for all the apps they're used to. That's what I think that this first version is supposed to do. Now, that said, I also thought Apple Watch Ultra and the whole concept of AirPods were kind of ugly. So I'm
Yep.
literally wearing that right now. So,
Do you have an
uh,
Ultra? Did you get an Ultra?
I do not currently have an Ultra,
Yeah.
but I very well might get one later
Yeah.
this fall. I live in Boulder, Colorado. Fun fact: Vision Pro was developed at the Apple office right down the road from me. But the so lots of like outdoorsy types around here. When the
Oh,
Apple
sure.
Watch Ultra launched, I saw it and I was like, I don't want to wear like the equivalent of an 1800s scuba diving helmet on my wrist all the time. But
With a sat phone built in. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. But then Curtis Herbert, the guy who developed the Slopes app, he won a Apple Design Award for that last year. He organizes the meetup group that I go to around here every month, and he got one and let me try it on. I was like, so I looked at it on the road. So I was like, this is actually nicer than I imagined it to be.
Hmm.
Maybe I really should get one of these. So I'm still on my old Series 5 right now, but
Mine's old too.
this
Yeah.
yeah, once I get the like the mental space to start thinking about developing watch OS apps in my spare time, I very well might get one in the coming months.
It's interesting. So I mean, with this Apple Vision Pro, to pull back a little on that, I mean, there's so much tech they have to really shake out, right? And they've never
Mm-hmm.
done any of our VR products. So like just getting the usability completely nailed, just getting like all those hand gestures debugged and figured out and working perfectly besides for just a demo. All the different features they have. I mean, I know they probably did a ton of work to get to the point where they could play with it. But
Yeah,
and they got to make it smaller. They got to make the power better. I mean, 2 hours on a battery pack is low for using
yeah,
something that's $3,500. Like, I wouldn't buy a $3,500 guitar that I can only play for 25 minutes.
right,
Yeah,
exactly,
like what do I do with this
exactly.
thing? Can't.
Yeah,
So it'll be interesting to see. But it's great that I think it's great that they're putting it out there and
hmm
they're letting people get that early version as opposed to
hmm
hiding it forever till they polish it to a diamond. you know?
Right, right. So, series of thoughts here. First of all, I actually don't think it's fair to say that they've never launched an AR product before.
No, that's, yeah.
Rather, yeah, ARKit has been around for several years now. In fact,
I meant
it's
wearable
actually,
headset
right.
thing. Like, right, it's to be like a competitor to like whatever
Sure.
the other ones, Steam headset and all the other ones that are
Yeah,
out there.
Oculus and all that.
Oculus, thank you. The Rift,
Yeah. The
and better than, you know.
Yeah, it was actually
that's where I
sort
was
of
going.
interesting to see that they've actually been launching all of the necessary components for this in other ways in the past several years. They started development on Vision Pro internally in 2015. It's been an internal product for 8 years now. So it's very explicit, like ARKit, Reality Kit, all of that exists to support Vision Pro, and were designed with Vision Pro in mind, even though these launched like before COVID-19 existed.
A long time ago.
Feels like a lifetime ago now.
Yeah.
This has been a long time coming for them. It's also not, I don't think it's meant to be a competitor to things like Oculus.
It's a whole new class of thing, really. It's a wearable computer. Yeah.
Exactly. Oculus is very explicitly a gaming platform. And while it's Apple seems to be trying to court game developers more intensely now, for Apple, I think Apple has been in a hardware position, in a better position than most Windows developers for a long time to run good games. It's just that they insist on things like Metal, and it's outside the realm of what game developers use to make games, and so they just never ported it over. They're trying to, like the new game porting toolkit and all that, they're trying to make that easier now. So I'm really excited to see what games do come out for it. But what I think so I was at this Apple meetup. The last meeting of this was so interesting because it was the first time all of the people who have been making Vision Pro for years could talk to us about it in public.
That must have been the coolest meeting. Yeah,
it was
absolutely.
It was great. But one of the Vision Pro developers used the metaphor that it's intended to be headphones for your eyes.
Yeah.
Like I'm talking to you on Chrome on my MacBook right now, but I still see like my messy apartment. There's my cat meowing in the background and all of that. This is all like I don't have to look at that anymore. I can just be in my own world doing my work and let the outside world in as much as I want to, because it's actually not transparent. Like it renders your eyes on the outside to give a facsimile of your presence to whoever's on the other side, but it is all rendering the outside world on screens and the inside world on another screen out there. It's not actually see-through transparent. You can control what you want to see and don't.
Yeah.
So that's from that perspective, it sounds like a pretty interesting whole new concept kind of product, especially with the whole concept of like spatial computing. And if you like your windows are all around you. One of the things the Apple developers mentioned that I understand you can sort of replicate this a little bit in the simulator right now, even though it's just a simulator, but even the audio is all spatial. So like if you put the music app above you and you like have to look up and interact with it, it'll sound like the music is coming from above you.
That's really cool. Yeah. It's neat stuff.
Right. You can turn that off per app if you want to. But it's just rendering all the software we build and use every day in the real world around us.
In a 3D place where you can say, I want my terminal over here. I want my, calendar over here. I want this here. And
exactly.
You want to play
if you want to put the Twitter app in front of the toilet and leave it there, you can totally do that.
That's probably where it belongs.
Yeah, exactly.
Flush it. Yeah. Wow. With a spring motion. Yeah. Well, I mean, so that's amazing to me. Like, I mean, obviously, if you think about like the evolution, it's really much more like what Google Glass wanted to be, like have that kind of heads up world, but then in a true 3D animated, truly like bring things in and out space with a lot of control. So it's like, it's really closer to that than it is like an Oculus or something, but with the physical headset dimensions of an Oculus, which is kind of wild.
And I think we'll eventually get to the point where it resembles Google Glass. It'll just probably be a decade or so.
Now. They got to work out the power management, the video. So that's a lot.
The power management thing, I understand lots of the Apple employees who worked on this internally just you leave it plugged in all the time, sitting
I
at their
would think
desk.
so.
That's
Yeah.
I think that's the main use case. However, the physical like wall power goes through the battery. So rather than being plugged in directly to the headset, you don't have to swap out the battery in order to do that. In fact, if you rip out the battery, the headset just dies instantly. There's no like few seconds where it's like plug the battery back in or you lose everything. It just goes black immediately. But you can disconnect the power cable and the battery's still there. You don't have to switch. In fact, you can actually daisy chain batteries. If you buy multiple one, like if you want 4 hours of battery life, buy 2 batteries and connect them together, plug the power cord into that.
You look like Chewie from Star Wars, the bandolier batteries.
Yeah.
You're all set. That's really wild.
So they want you to be able to use this eventually. It's just that there is so much hardware packed into this. It has more processing power than the Mac Pro they launched alongside it that costs like $50,000. It's just there's so much processing power that goes into this with all the new AI stuff that it does. It just needs more space and more electricity, and we're already reaching the limits of Moore's law. So there's only so far you can go to design around that.
Yeah.
They'll figure it out. This is not where it's going to end up. It's just where it's starting.
But it's definitely a great start to, I mean, it's a great start for engineers to create something cool in the coming years, knowing that most Apple things are hits eventually. Most.
Right, yeah. I mean, like, think about the original iPhone when it launched in 2007. Yeah. It barely had a functioning web browser at the time, and nowadays it has more processing power than my laptop.
And it blew everyone's mind when it came out. It really did. I mean, I remember taking my Palm Pilot or Treo or whatever at the time and go, see ya. I think I had an AT&T, like, 3G phone, and I'm like, get rid of this thing, And eventually, look what we have now. We have supercomputers in our pockets, so it's just fantastic. Yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on it, and literally keep 2 eyes on it, and then see where the betas go and the hardware SDKs. Hopefully, they come out with a hardware kit to play with that. That they eventually release for companies like us to really play around with down the line a year or two from now. Should be interesting. All right, but they announced a lot more than that, obviously. So they've had like revs to all their operating systems. And, I'm looking here, like you see iOS 17. There are a lot of like, useful productivity app changes. What are some of the core guts of like iOS 17, for example, that are really like built for new types of interfaces or new APIs?
So developer focused thing. So SharePlay got a lot cooler, for example. SharePlay is Apple's built-in tech to like synchronize experiences across distances. So like say you and your friends want to watch a movie together. You're in Philadelphia, I'm in Colorado. We could open up, I don't think the Netflix app supports this, but hypothetically, if it did, we could both open up the Netflix app and tap the SharePlay button and decide that we want to watch a movie together, and it'll keep our Netflix apps in sync so that we're always watching the same thing at the same point. If you pause it, it pauses on mine also. So there are lots of new interesting APIs around that, like, for example, with CarPlay, got SharePlay support. So on the day the betas came out, I was at a watch party with all the Boulder Apple developers around here, and one of them drives a Lucid Air. It's a really cool car. But it has CarPlay support, and so when he updated his phone to iOS 17, he got iOS 17 CarPlay because CarPlay runs through your phone and all that, which means he got SharePlay. So you could manage, you could create like a car-wide playlist. So you press the SharePlay button on the car, it brings up a QR code, and everyone in the car can scan it. And now all of our Apple Musics are, we can make like a collaborative playlist just for whoever's in the car and play through the speakers. So there's new APIs around that are really cool. The AirDrop is really interesting. Now, if you remember, do you remember like 10 years ago when the Bump app was popular?
Yep, I do.
Yeah, and then Apple bought that, and then nobody ever heard about it again.
Yeah.
It seems like that tech is back now. Sharing contacts, for example, is as simple. I think they call it name drop. It's as simple as it's as simple as bringing your phone close to someone else's. It's like, oh, do you all want to share your contacts with each other? You can make like a whole poster for when you're calling.
They started that, by the way, with the Wi-Fi settings a couple of years back. Do you remember that? Where like if you wanted to connect to someone else's like Wi-Fi hotspot or whatever, you could like touch the phones. They could say, "Do you want to connect up?" And you know, like the early version was that, I remember. But it's good to know that it's going like contacts. That's good.
That's been around for a minute. That's where if you attempt to connect to a Wi-Fi network that you don't have the password to yet, but someone who is in your contacts and you're in their contacts is nearby, they'll get a notification on their phone that like, yeah, you're trying to connect to this Wi-Fi network. Do you want to share the password with them? And they can just tap a button and yes, and then it'll autofill. And it's really cool.
Interesting that's better integrated now for other things. That's kind of cool. Yeah.
Right. So sharing and all that works like that. I think the iOS 17 feature I'm most excited about is called Assistive Access. It's I understand there will be new APIs for this. I haven't played around with them yet, but they will exist in the near future if they don't already. But the idea is that it is designed for people with cognitive disabilities who like your standard, like I hired a designer for my iPhone app kind of interface is very well might be too complicated for them to like parse and comprehend properly. It's full of like big buttons with pictures, just an really like incredibly simple interface. So the use case that I'm imagining for this and I'm excited about is my grandma has an iPhone, and she's a smart woman. She's getting kind of old, and her like you can tell she's deteriorating a little bit mentally. Side note about her, I found out, so she used to be a professor at Temple. She just sort of like casually mentioned, like she tells this story where it slowly dawned on me that she was like the third ever user of Fortran. Like she was wild. She was the TA for the guy who made Fortran.
No way.
Yeah. And then now decades later, she handed me the TV remote a while ago and asked me what the on button does.
Yeah, that happens. I know.
Yeah. And 2 or 3 years ago, right before COVID-19 became a thing in the United States, she was visiting me and she asked a few things about her computers, and I realized she had never heard of Google before.
Wow.
So I'm really hoping Assistive Access will make it easy for her to use her iPhone, because she has a lot of difficulty with that right now. But it is designed so that it shouldn't be hard for her anymore. And I'm really excited about that.
Like large touch targets that like it can like debounce things when if you're shaking, for example. Those kind of like for people who have a hard time touching and pressing things the right way. Like there's some of that in the assistive options, but you're saying this is a whole like UI kit for that.
Rather than like look how complicated my home screen is. Like I got all these squares, these like widgets and stuff that give me different notifications, all these little notifications. I can scroll forever. I can run out of these home screens and end up with this weird app library thing. If I scroll the other direction, then I get like the widgets. Like all the widgets all at once. If I pull down, I can get the spotlight search and all the weird complexities with that. Rather than having all that, you just get a vertical scrolling list of like icon, app name. That's it.
Good. That's good. Yeah. For people who really need that, that's a very good thing.
And so their apps can design their interfaces around that. So rather than having all of these complicated things, like every designer out there has their own design system. People think it's a good idea to use material design on iOS for some reason. Things are just so inconsistent and weird. It doesn't have to be like that anymore. I'm really happy about it. Right.
How about anything in like so I know iPadOS now it's a separate OS because it just released so many different features for it specifically. It's getting closer in terms of being useful on its own. I still wish they would give full cursive support for Unix, terminals and things like that, and actually make it really usable that way. But it's not going to happen, I don't think, just because they still want to delineate computer versus tablet. But What do you think's coming down the pike on iPadOS specifically that would be really useful? Do you think? I know I'm trying to put you on the spot there, but
yeah. So with iPadOS, you're right. It is essentially like a marketing name for a full iOS. So
hardware flag on, show these features, probably.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, so like lots of things that you will be familiar with from iOS, it's just the same on iPadOS. I'm not sure Apple spent a ton of time on it in their keynote. I think like some of the most interesting things were just like, yeah, you can put widgets on your lock screen now. That's cool. Also with macOS, you can put widgets on your like desktop screen, but they're like mirrored off of your iPhone. So like your iPhone widgets can be present on your Mac now, which is kind of cool, but that's
nice. Yeah.
That said, I'm a little bit more optimistic than I think you are on where Apple might want to go with iPadOS. I'm not sure how the introduction of visionOS complicates that, but like you have been able to build apps on iPadOS and ship them to the App Store for a year or two now. That's what Swift Playgrounds does. They launched Logic Pro and Final Cut Pro on iPad now.
By the way, I've been using Logic Pro on iPad. It's freaking great. As a very bad musician, and I mean, I can play some things well, but I'm not like, you're not going to see me come up with my next like beats.
Right.
But
yeah.
It's got, what they did with that was they actually really enabled the touch interface to be super useful. And in Logic, you would constantly be going into all the like the synthesizers and machines and clicking with a mouse, which is like, it's great, but I'm on a mouse or a trackpad. And now you can just like directly interact with the screen, and it's basically the same. They have a ton of plugins. It's fantastic.
It's been an eternity since I have like done anything music related, used Logic or anything like that. But when I always did think about like how this would feel a lot nicer on an iPad with a touch kind of UI. GarageBand has been on iPad for since I was in high school. Yep. But like,
and it's good for that purpose.
The same thing. Yeah.
No, it's good for that purpose, like scratching out a quick demo or something like that. But wow, it literally is. You can transfer the stuff back and forth between the two, and as long as you're not using third-party plugins that you can't mount, it's wow, it's wild. Yeah. So it clearly has the horsepower to do these things.
Oh, absolutely. It uses M1 and modern iPads are M1 and M2 as well, just like the same chips that they put in MacBooks and stuff. Right. Hardware-wise, it totally has the power to. It's just not designed that way. It's meant to be like a thing you take on a plane and get work done while you're not in front of a computer. Yeah. Like I said before, I'm not sure how the Vision Pro landscape will complicate that. I know they will eventually want you to take Vision Pro everywhere. One of the Apple engineers told me about how it's explicitly supported that if you are on like a plane, you can put a UI window, app window outside your plane's window. So like,
that'd be disturbing.
If you would rather like see, if you're just passing over the Atlantic Ocean or something, there's nothing out there, you'd rather see the mountains, you can just put a picture there. It's fine.
You put the Twilight Zone episode with William Shatner being afraid of the gremlins on the plane outside the plane. That would be something.
You could totally build that now. That'll be so cool. I want to figure out a good app idea that I can launch like day one for Vision Pro and build it, but I just haven't had anything that's a funny one. The closest thing that I've thought of so far is I want my notifications to bust through the wall like the Kool-Aid man.
Oh yeah.
Exactly like that.
That'd be so great.
I don't think there's a way to hook the system API and force that. I'll have to jailbreak a Vision Pro or something. But
well, you could do like the monster from Stranger Things, peeling away your wall and walking out.
That'd be wild.
That'd be great. Yeah, like ants on the new version of ants on your screen. It's terrify people with a monster coming at them. So
Christian Seelig, the guy who made Apollo, that Reddit had like publicly murdered gruesomely in the past couple weeks. Yes. Prior to that whole saga, he had also, it started as a feature of Apollo. He had this thing called Pixel Pals, where he figured out all the layout math for the dynamic island on iPhone 14, so he could render a little like pet right above that all the time. That'll be so cool on Vision Pro. Like, right? You could just sort of like a Tamagotchi from 2023. Just have like a rendered cat just
You sit here on my table. And
yeah,
it's
exactly.
Like, yeah, right.
Exactly.
That'd
Way more easy to control than my real cat.
Oh yeah. Well, you can't control a cat. Cats don't respond to control inputs.
Oh yeah, exactly. I can't just tell her to like sit on my desk and be cute for 4 hours.
It'd be amazing if the cat went, gotcha, and then did that. You're like,
Yeah,
what kind of cat is this?
It's all the benefits of a pet with none of the responsibilities. It's great.
Leave the food out, leave the litter box clean and enough water, and they'll live with you and without you for a couple of days even.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well, cool. So, I mean, I know we went through a lot of stuff here, but it's fun to talk and it's fun to check in on where these things are headed. Let's check in as you start digging into some of the betas and stuff like that and really like kicking the tires.
Yeah, sounds great. I've been using macOS 17 on my and a new volume on my personal Mac for a minute. Had a good time with that. Played around with some of the Xcode betas. I think some of the things I'm most excited for are in Xcode, the Xcode update itself. Like it has integrations with OS log, which you've been using for the past 7 years instead of print, right? Like localization manages it all in a catalog. It's extracted by the compiler, and lots of great things updated managing around that. Testing has a bunch of new stuff that's really cool. So yeah, excited to get to play with all of that. Once it gets to the point of being in public beta, I might even install it on my iPhone, see how that goes. So
it's a little more stable that you can get through it. Because I usually do that with the public betas eventually. I'll get to some version, I'll put it on my iPhone or something like that. I know it's risky, but so far I've not been let down by that. So, get a little bit of a preview.
Yeah, the people around here who I've talked to said it's that did bite the bullet and do it. So said it's been pretty cool so far. I did talk to one guy who says that so full disclosure, please don't judge me too hard. I drive a Tesla.
No.
The Tesla app apparently is just totally broken on this. Like the Tesla app is the key to my car.
Right.
And it just just doesn't work on iOS 17. So I'm gonna wait until they fix that. But
I would surely wait. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it'll be great to check in with you once we get closer to a release candidate.
Awesome. Michael, thank you so much for spending the hour with us. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed this too.
All right. Good talking to you, man. See ya.